Who's ready to talk about ethics? All right, class, this week we're talking about ethics and self-awareness, two important areas that will help us avoid bad situations in helping. First of all, why do ethics matter? What are ethics to begin with? Ethics are, simply put, values or morals or rules that each profession has to sort of guide their work. And one thing that we know is that as a helper, no matter your path that you take in your particular career, you're going to be working with people who are often dealing with a lot of problems. You might go to places with people where they become activated and upset, and you're probably going to end up in a situation at some point or another where there is some amount of risk. Ethics are going to be important tools for helping you navigate difficult situations with clients so that they are getting their needs met and you are also doing the best that you can and protecting yourself at the same time. I'll quickly note that not every profession has the same code of ethics, so that's going to be important to remember. But let's quickly break down the 6 core areas seen in most ethical codes that are also listed in the book. First, let's go over autonomy. Now, autonomy means that the client, as well as the counselor, has a right to make their own choices, so long as those choices are not dangerous. Now, we'll discuss what happens if a client makes a dangerous choice later. But for the most part, clients have the right to choose what they want. For the most part, that's really good for counselors and helpers and easy for us to do because obviously we want them to be making their own choices. But there will be times that clients make decisions that you don't agree with. But it's important to remember that most of all, they have the right to choose what they wish. And also, things that work for us or work for other clients might not work for this client. Sometimes someone is different and unique and they just need to go a different way. But as a helper, it's always important that we respect the autonomy of our clients to make their own choices. The next ethical principle that we'll discuss is beneficence. Beneficence simply means that as a helper, you should always intend to do good, to be committed to the growth and wellness of your client. Seems simple, right? But it is difficult because we don't always know what is the best choice or what is going to be the most good for our client, but it's kind of an aspirational ethic that we always try to do good. It's also important to note that even though as a helper it is your profession and you're probably doing it to support yourself, it's important that you tend to put the idea that you're doing this to help your clients above making any kind of personal profit. This is a challenging but important personal ethic to all types of helpers. Next is non-malfeasance. Don't worry, you won't be asked to pronounce that word too many times in your career. Non-malfeasance, simply put, is to do no harm. This is an ethical code, for example, that doctors tend to hold to. But regardless, that becomes a little trickier for us than it does a doctor who's simply trying to not harm his client physically. We will probably at some point hurt the feelings of our clients or upset them in some way. We might even make their lives more difficult without meaning to. However, at the end of the day, overall, we should see the big picture and try to think, is what I'm doing ultimately going to harm my client or is it going to help them towards a better future? Next is justice. I'm sure we all have a lot of ideas about what justice means, but in the context of being a helper, most often it means you just trying to be fair, providing the same opportunities and resources for your client, and not providing better treatment for clients that you like over clients that you prefer less. At the offset, this may not seem very difficult, but when you are working as a helper for a while and you get exhausted, it can be easy to forget that you might have a little bit of energy for one client that you don't have another. It's good to be aware of yourself and realize and ask yourself, am I providing the same quality of care to all of my clients, regardless of how I feel about them, and regardless of who they are? Next is fidelity, which we might think of sometimes as being faithful or trustworthy. Much like Lassie, your client should be able to depend on you. You should show up to appointments on time. You should get your case notes done on time, or whatever your job is, but you should do what they expect you to do as a professional and be trustworthy in how you carry out your roles and responsibilities. Clients will sense whether or not you are keeping up with your responsibilities, and they will have more confidence in you if you can maintain professional, trustworthy behaviors. And lastly, veracity, which just means sort of being truthful. This is perhaps one of the easiest or simplest concepts to understand, but one of the hardest to practice day to day. Why? Because sometimes telling the truth is a little uncomfortable. As a helper, sometimes that you will be aware of things, maybe of ways that your client is being incongruous, or maybe ways that your client isn't seeing some things that they need to see. And you're in a unique position to often communicate hard truths. Just remember that sometimes having a helpful conversation can save a lot of pain later on about things your client needs to be aware of. And of course, being honest also extends to being honest about what helping is going to look like, what are the limits of helping, and what can they expect. But mostly you just need to remember it is important to be honest with your clients even when it feels personally difficult. As long as we communicate the truth in a caring and helpful way, as long as we maintain the other codes of ethics, we should be okay. I just wanted to check in with you a moment because this isn't always easy. For example, what do you do when a client is about to make a decision and they think it's the best decision, so you're trying to respect their autonomy, but you also fear that it's not ultimately in their best interest, and you also feel like you have to show beneficence and always do good. Or it's also your job to be honest, to have veracity. But sometimes a client may not be ready to hear a hard truth, and you may have to judge how long you need to wait to communicate that information before you are ready to communicate it in the right way and they are ready to hear it. So just remember that we need to know these ethical codes and try to apply these ethical codes. And it's also just good to talk to your supervisor or confer with the appropriate colleagues to make sure you're just making the best decisions that you can. Being a helper is hard. It's also really important to know your professional code of ethics. As a counselor, I abide by the American Counseling Association, ACA, Code of Ethics, which they just republished in 2014. If you're interested in checking out that code of ethics, go to counseling.org and search for ethics. Your future profession, however, may have a different code of ethics, so it's important to explore that as soon as you can. Now let's just quickly highlight some of the ethical issues that new helpers in particular need to pay attention to in practice. I'm not going to go over everything that was in the book, so be sure that you read as usual. But let's first discuss a really big one, confidentiality. Simply put, in a helping situation, whether or not it is your professional mandate to keep everything confidential, of course to the limits of confidentiality, or if it's just an aspirational ethic, it is a good idea to keep things that are discussed in a helping relationship confidential. And for me as a counselor, I'm required to. That is also going to be important in your final projects, which I'll send out more information about that later, but everything that you say, even in your role play for this class, that is said by your client needs to remain confidential. And what is confidentiality? It means that you do not discuss anything with anybody else about what was said between you and the helper. Now, of course, reasonably, there are a couple limits to that. So here are the limits. First of all, if you have to talk to a supervisor. For this class, you'll be talking to me about your experience trying to help whoever it is that you get as a volunteer. But in future roles, you're going to need to talk to a supervisor, or sometimes there'll be supervisor meetings with other colleagues, and so you'll speak as colleagues, but it'll be within a guarded professional setting with only select individuals. Second, if your client is a threat to themselves or others, it's also important to know state laws on this. For example, I just came from North Carolina, and if you knew of anyone that was suicidal, you were legally required to report it. So understanding that if your client is a threat to themselves or to someone else, if they threaten to harm someone else or kill someone else, you have to break confidentiality. That also applies to if you know that a child, an elderly person, or someone who is disabled is in danger of harm. We always have to report that because first and foremost, our job is to keep people safe. Also, your client can give you permission to speak to someone about something that you guys have discussed, but I think it's a good idea that if your client ever asks you to share information, that you get very explicit details from them about what they do and do not want you to share. And most importantly, inform clients about the limits to confidentiality and how confidentiality works before you start doing any work with them. This will be important in your project that I see you go over confidentiality with your clients as well as the limits to it. But confidentiality is an important tool for helping people feel comfortable to share and grow in a helping relationship. Another important concept for new helpers and helpers of all ages is that you have to work within your limits. This can be really tricky at first when you're just learning how to be a helper and how to deal with basic things. And along your career, you will gain more and more experience and expertise. So it's important that you're always working within the scope of your practice. And if you're working with something new or challenging, make sure that you're consulting with other people to be sure that you're providing the right care. If it is truly beyond the scope of your abilities, you need to refer out. For example, as a counselor, I don't prescribe medication, obviously, so I would always refer to a psychiatrist. I can work with people who are severely mentally ill, in addition to people with regular life issues, but whenever I have worked with someone with a more severe mental illness, I'm making sure that I'm consulting with their doctors or their psychiatrists or anyone else that they're working with to be sure that my care is where it needs to be. If I were working with an issue that I know is too activating for me, like I do not enjoy working with children who've been abused, I refer that to someone else because it's not within the limits of my practice because I know that I can't do a good job. So know your limits, and as you continue in your career, try to be aware of what your real limits are professionally and personally that would impact your professional abilities. Also in limits, just remember that you are not supposed to help your friends or family members as professionals. A lot of times friends and family members of helpers will ask for more feedback or information from that person in their family who's a helper. And of course it's fine to practice your skills, but make sure informally, for example, having active listening, but make sure that they know and you know that you are not helping them as a professional in that capacity. Hope that makes sense and I didn't just make that muddier. Next, remember that it's always important to educate your clients about the helping process. As a new helper, you may feel like there's a lot that you don't know about helping, but you actually know a lot compared to the average person seeking help. So be sure in every helping interaction that you make sure that your clients know what to expect. Clarify your role. What can you do as a helper? For example, you can listen to them, support them, provide feedback to them, but not advice. And what can't you do? It's not your job to make choices for them. It's not your job to live their life for them. You also obviously can't force them to do anything. So letting them know how they can work with you, how you guys work as a team, and how your roles look together can be really helpful and important. And obviously educating them about, regardless of what profession you go in, what that looks like when you see clients. Like for me, I tell clients I usually will see for about an hour. Sometimes that might go over a little bit, but I'll try to keep it to an hour most times. Let them know how much therapy might cost. Let them know about how long counseling might take. Granted it's different for everyone, but most people need to come for at least 8 sessions if they want to start seeing anything happen, etc. So that could be different for you depending on what you do. But I like to give clients in the first session a kind of good rundown about what they can expect, of course. Next, start to think about how you're going to have healthy boundaries as a helper. Again, that could vary by profession. As a counselor, my boundaries look very different from a social worker who might work in a children's center and sees children informally, or a school counselor who kids come in at different times of day without a set schedule. But having healthy boundaries and having reasonable boundaries within your helping relationships. For example, most helpers really shouldn't give out their personal phone number because then a client is calling you all the time and might depend on you more than they need to. Remember, clients need to also build some sense of self-efficacy. Be available, but don't be overly flexible for clients. For me, that means if a client keeps canceling and trying to reschedule with me, I might say, hey, these are the times I'm available. You need to meet me where I am. Because sometimes if we're overly flexible, that allows clients to kind of continue some bad behaviors that they might have tendencies towards. And of course, don't use clients for personal benefit. So that's a boundary to protect them. Don't try to help certain people to gain favor with someone else, or don't, of course, take advantage of your clients in any way for personal gain. And a big one is avoiding dual relationships. Dual relationships are when you have some kind of connection with a client outside of the helping relationship. So sometimes people who are in helping relationships, the clients, they want to be friends with helpers. It's generally a good idea that doesn't happen, or at least that a few years go by. I think in counseling, at the limit, we have 2 or 3 years before we can become friends with someone that we do counseling with, but really it's kind of recommended 5 years because clients don't always understand that the relationship that we're in with them is not the relationship that we would be with them if they were our friends. My clients don't have to be my friends, and therefore don't have to listen to me complain about my life. So it's important that clients understand that, and you can communicate the boundaries around your relationship in a respectful but clear way. Biggest rule ever, never ever sleep with a client. Just don't do it. Don't. And also be really cautious when working with friends or family members of your original client. Let's say you have a client and you need to bring in talking to their partner or their child to kind of help support the therapy that you're doing with your original client. Make sure that your client stays your original client. Sometimes bringing in other family members or friends can kind of complicate sort of who you are serving, if that makes sense. You may see other sides of your client and start to feel like you need to be helping the friend more, the family member more, and that makes things kind of fuzzy. So that's probably just more confusing, but you know what? It is really confusing. So consult, and always talk to your supervisors. And we're going to end out this video in talking about ethics by highlighting the importance of self-awareness. And we're going to discuss self-awareness, hopefully briefly, in the next video. But I hope that you kind of have an appreciation of the fact that as a helper, we set a very high standard for ourselves. And with that, there are a lot of goals that we have for our clients and a lot of things that we want to do well. To be an ethical helper, however, we also have to be aware of ourselves. Being a helper requires a lot of personal work and knowing who we are, because the ways that we have biases, ways that we maybe aren't paying attention to ourselves or taking care of ourselves can really impact our ability to do our job in an ethical manner. So ethics and self-awareness are two things that constantly inform one another. Ethical rules give us things to think about, standards to aspire to, but in turn, ethics make us think about ourselves and if we're meeting those needs of our clients, and then also being self-aware and thinking about who we are and how we can be more ethical. They just go together. So take a break, do something fun for a while, and then come back and watch the other video on self-awareness. Have a good week, you guys.